On March 14, 1895, at the Manchester Children's Home in England, a photographer named Edward Collins took what looked like a touching photo of two brothers saying goodbye. In the picture, 12-year-old Thomas Ashford stands with his arms around his 8-year-old brother, William. Both boys look toward the camera with expressions that seem almost cheerful at first glance. Thomas is dressed in a clean, well-made suit, far nicer than anything boys in the home usually received. William wears a standard workhouse uniform that marked him as one of the many children living there. Next to them stands a well-dressed man labeled in the photographer's notes as Mr. Harold Petton, listed as a supporter of the home. The official explanation in the records was simple. Mr. Petton was adopting Thomas and giving him a chance at a better life. William would stay behind until another family selected him. It was presented as a hopeful moment, one brother receiving a new start to the kindness of a generous adult. That story held until 2019, when digital restoration specialist Dr. Rebecca Morrison examined the photo at extremely high magnification. She noticed something in Mr. Petton's coat pocket, a folded document that wasn't fully hidden. Once researchers identified what it was, they uncovered a disturbing truth. It exposed a system in which orphaned children were secretly sent into long-term labor under the appearance of charitable placements. Thomas wasn't being adopted at all. He was being sent away under an agreement he never agreed to. This is the story of two brothers who said goodbye in 1895, and a photograph that revealed, more than a century later, that their separation was not an act of kindness, but part of a larger exploitative process. Thomas and William became orphans in November 1893. When their parents passed away within 2 weeks of each other during a typhoid outbreak in Manchester. Their father, Robert, worked in a textile mill and could barely support the family in a small 2-room home. Their mother, Mary, took in laundry to help make ends meet. When the illness swept through the city, both parents fell sick. Robert passed on November 8th, and Mary died on November 22nd. Thomas was 10. William was 6. No relatives were able to take them in. On November 25, 1893, the boys were admitted to the Manchester Children's Home, a workhouse-style institution for children without family support. Records show that Thomas, age 10, was healthy, able to work, and could read and write. William, age 6, was healthy but small for his age and still learning basic skills. Both parents were listed as deceased, and the boys were marked as waiting for adoption or placement. Life inside the home was strict. Children woke at 5 in the morning, worked in a laundry or workshop until evening, received very limited schooling, and lived on a simple diet. Rules were enforced strongly, and the home held around 300 children with only a small staff. Many viewed the children mainly as labor. Thomas and William, like all siblings there, were separated by age and lived in different dorms. They were allowed to see each other only for 1 hour on Sundays after chapel. During that hour, they would sit together in the cold courtyard. Thomas would tell William stories about their parents and promise that they would stay together no matter what. For 16 months, the brothers lived under these conditions, hoping for a placement that might take them out of the system. In March 1895, it seemed Thomas finally had a chance. The director, Mr. Charles Morrison, called him into his office and explained that Mr. Harold Petton, a textile merchant from Yorkshire, wanted to adopt him. Petton was described as a widower who wanted to raise a promising boy and eventually pass on his business. At age 12, Thomas understood what this could mean: a real home and education and a future outside the workhouse. But it also meant leaving William behind. The photo was taken on the day Thomas was supposed to leave with Mr. Petton. The home regularly photographed children being adopted or placed, partly for records and partly to show supporters that children were being given new opportunities. Edward Collins, a photographer, set up his equipment in the director's office. Thomas wore the new suit provided for the occasion. William, still in his uniform, wrapped his arms around him. The picture appeared to show a sad but hopeful goodbye, one brother moving toward a better life, the other waiting his turn. But that wasn't what was happening. Thomas, William, and most people at the time had no idea that he wasn't being adopted. He was being taken for a different purpose. Between 1869 and 1948, around 100,000 British children Orphans, children from struggling families, and those seen as having no place in crowded cities, were sent to Canada, Australia, and other parts of the Commonwealth under programs promoted as charitable migration or helpful relocation. Officials claimed it would create new chances for children and reduce strain on crowded institutions. The reality was very different. Many of these children were not adopted. They were placed into long-term labor contracts until their late teens or early 20s, working on farms and homes or in factories. Most were separated from siblings, sometimes given new names, and often received only basic schooling. They had little protection if they were treated unfairly. Meanwhile, workhouses, transport companies, and employers benefited financially from the system. Several organizations took part in these programs, ranging from large, well-known charities to smaller groups. Some believed they were helping children. Others focused on the financial incentives tied to sending children abroad. Records found in 2019 in the West Yorkshire Archives show that Harold Petton worked as a recruiter for one of the smaller groups, the British Juvenile Immigration Society. This organization worked with Canadian farming interests to supply young laborers. Petton's job was to visit children's homes, choose healthy boys and girls, usually between 10 and 14, and arrange for them to be sent to Canada. He was paid for each child he selected, and the Manchester Children's Home also received a payment for every child who left through the program. Thomas, healthy and 12, fit the profile perfectly. The new suit, the promise of inheritance, and the friendly manner were part of the process used to gain trust. Thomas believed he was leaving with a new guardian. In truth, he was being sent to a farm in rural Ontario, where he would work without wages until he reached adulthood. The paper in Mr. Petton's coat pocket, the one revealed more than a century later through digital restoration, was Thomas's labor contract. It outlined 9 years of unpaid work, room and board, limited schooling depending on farm needs, and no communication with family in England. It also offered no protection if he faced difficulties. Thomas would soon be placed on a ship to Canada. Within 2 weeks, Thomas was on his way out of England. He never saw William again. He never learned what became of him, and William never knew what happened to Thomas. The photo taken on March 14th, 1895, shows their final moment together. They believe it was only a short time apart, but it was actually a permanent separation arranged by adults who benefited from sending children away. For more than a century, the proof sat in full view, hidden only by the limits of old photography. It was right there in Harold Petton's coat pocket, unnoticed until technology made it visible. On March 28, 1895, Thomas boarded the SS Sardinian. He was one of 73 children on that ship, ages 8 through 14, all sent to Canada through various programs. The passenger list, kept in Canadian immigration files, listed him as Thomas Ashford, age 12, destination Fairview Farm, Middlesex County, Ontario. Sponsor, British Juvenile Immigration Society. Status, indentured worker. Thomas arrived in Ontario in April 1895 and was sent to Fairview Farm, a large 400-acre operation owned by the Patterson family. For the next 9 years, until he turned 21 in 1904, Thomas worked on the farm without pay. He slept in a loft, worked long days, received very limited schooling, and had no contact with anyone from his past. The Pattersons were not unusually harsh at the time, but they were not a family to him. He was a worker, not a son. He was given enough food, minimal clothing, constant chores, and no sense of belonging. When his contract ended in 1904, Thomas was 21. He had no savings, basic literacy, and farm labor as his only skill. With nowhere to go, he stayed on at Fairview Farm as a paid worker, earning a small wage but still tied to the same land he had arrived on years earlier. Thomas never returned to England. He never searched for William because he had no money for travel and no way to track a brother who could have been placed anywhere. He simply hoped William had found a life of his own. In 1910, Thomas married a Canadian woman named Ella McBride. They had 3 children. He spent his life working on farms across Ontario and never reached the secure life that Harold Petton had promised back in Manchester. Thomas passed away in 1967 at age 84 in London, Ontario. His obituary was short. Thomas Ashford, longtime resident, survived by wife Ellen, children Margaret, Robert, and Thomas Jr., and 5 grandchildren. Service on Friday. He died never knowing what had happened to William. He died believing he had been adopted in 1895, unaware that he had been placed into a system that separated siblings and sent children away under the appearance of charity. Meanwhile, after Thomas left in March 1895, William stayed at the Manchester Children's Home. He was 8 years old. Every Sunday, he waited for a letter from Thomas, one he didn't know would never reach him. Staff told him that Thomas had gone on to a better life and encouraged him to be glad for his brother. William stayed at the home for 6 more years. At age 14, in 1901, he was apprenticed to a cotton mill in Manchester, the same type of difficult work their father had once done. He worked there for 3 years. In November 1904, at age 17, William passed away from a respiratory illness caused by the cotton dust he breathed at the mill. He was buried in a simple grave in Phillips Park Cemetery. He died never knowing that Thomas hadn't forgotten him, hadn't chosen to leave him, but had been sent across the ocean with no way back. The brothers were separated by a system described as charitable, but driven by the needs of institutions, not by the needs of the children themselves. And for more than a century, no one knew what truly happened that day in March 1895. The photo of Thomas and William stayed in the Manchester Children's Home archives for 124 years. When the home closed in 1952, its records, including thousands of photographs, were transferred to the Manchester City Archives. The image was labeled simply as Brothers Embracing March 14, 1895. Thomas Ashford, age 12, adopted by Mr. Harold Petton. William Ashford, age 8, remaining at home. Photographer, Edward Collins. For decades, the photo sat in storage. Researchers occasionally viewed it while studying Victorian child welfare programs, but no one had examined it closely. In 2018, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a historian who focused on these migration schemes, began a research project on how such programs were recorded and explained by the groups involved. She requested access to the Manchester Children's Home photo collection. In March 2019, she came across the picture of Thomas and William. "I noticed their expressions right away," she said in a 2020 interview. "Thomas doesn't look happy. William looks heartbroken. The record said it was an adoption, but the photo suggested something else." She also noticed Mr. Petton in the background. The notes called him a benefactor, but Rebecca recognized his name from past research. He had appeared as a recruiter for the British Juvenile Immigration Society, not as an adoptive parent. Rebecca arranged for the photo to be scanned at extremely high resolution and imported it into analysis software. At 5,000% magnification, she studied the boys' faces, clothing, and posture. At 10,000%, she examined Petton, his expression, his stance, the contrast between his fine clothing and the modest surroundings. At 15,000%, she focused on his coat. Then she saw it, a folded paper showing from his pocket. At normal size, it looked like nothing at all, but under magnification, printed text began to appear. At 18,000%, with enhancement, she could read the words: Indenture Contract, British Juvenile Immigration Society, duration until age 21. In that moment, she understood what the document meant. This was not an adoption. It was a contract binding Thomas to years of unpaid work. She compared the date on the photo with ship records and found Thomas listed as an indentured worker on the SS Sardinian. She checked Canadian records and found his arrival, his placement at Fairview Farm, and his contract filed in local archives. The photo had captured evidence that had gone unnoticed for 124 years. Rebecca then looked for records on William. What she found was heartbreaking. Her discovery of the contract also led her to study the broader work of the British Juvenile Immigration Society. She learned that between 1890 and 1910, the group arranged for more than 2,000 children from British institutions to be sent to Canada. The organization described its work as giving children new opportunities, but the records she uncovered showed a system that often placed children into labor instead of family homes. In reality, the society received payments from Canadian farming groups to supply inexpensive child labor. They selected healthy boys and girls between 10 and 14 from institutions, told them they were being adopted or placed in training programs, and then sent them to Canada under contracts that required years of unpaid work. Rebecca later found the group's financial records in the West Yorkshire archives. These documents showed that the society was paid £5 per child by Canadian employers, while British homes received £3 for each placement they arranged. No one contacted parents or relatives, and most of the children involved were orphans with no support. They were promised schooling, caring homes, and opportunity, but almost none of this was checked once they arrived overseas. Harold Petton had worked for the organization from 1892 to 1899, gathering children from institutions in Manchester, Liverpool, and Leeds. Records showed he arranged placements for 147 children in those 7 years and earned about £735 in commissions, worth more than £100,000 today. Petton passed away in 1903 and was never questioned for his role. Newspaper notices at the time described him as someone who helped children start new lives abroad. Rebecca then tracked what happened to the children Petton helped send away. Using ship manifest immigration records and census files, she confirmed that 147 children left Britain through his efforts between 1892 and 1899. Of those, 89 could be followed through Canadian records. 12 died before age 18 due to accidents, illness, or harsh conditions. 34 spent their lives working on farms. 23 later moved to cities and found other types of work. 20 could not be traced after their contracts ended. Few ever returned to Britain, and most had lost contact with any siblings they once had. Many were even given new last names by employers, making it nearly impossible for family members to find them. Rebecca also studied what happened to the children left behind in British homes. Children like William, who watched brothers or sisters leave for what they were told would be better lives, only to never hear from them again. Many of these children died young due to workplace accidents, illness, or the difficult conditions of the era. They waited for letters that never arrived, not knowing their siblings had been sent across the ocean with no way to write or return. The system broke families apart. It separated children who could have supported one another and used their vulnerability for financial gain, even while presenting itself as charitable. And the proof of this had been hiding in photographs like the one of Thomas and William, images that held small details no one had been able to examine closely until technology made it possible. In January 2020, Dr. Rebecca Morrison published her findings in the Journal of British Social History. Her article, titled Hidden Evidence, Child Trafficking in Victorian Orphanage Photographs, included the story of Thomas and William and the enhanced image showing the contract in Petton's pocket. The article drew immediate attention. The Manchester Guardian ran a front-page headline announcing that Victorian orphans had been sent abroad under false pretenses, and that a photograph had uncovered a 125-year-old scheme. Soon after, descendants of both brothers reached out to Rebecca. Thomas's granddaughter, Margaret Ashford Williams, living in Toronto, had always known her grandfather came to Canada as a child. She had been told he was adopted by a wealthy family who later passed away, leaving him to support himself. Learning he was actually brought here as unpaid labor and that he'd been misled about the adoption changes how we understand everything, Margaret said. He never talked about his childhood. We thought he wanted to forget the orphanage. Now we realize he also lost his brother and had no way back. Rebecca also found relatives of William through family records. William had no children of his own, but his mother's sister's line continued. William's great-great-nephew, James Hartley of Manchester, had heard that his great-great-aunt Mary died in 1893, leaving 2 boys behind, but he never knew what became of them. Finding out William died at 17 in a factory, still hoping to hear from Thomas, not knowing he'd been sent overseas. It's heartbreaking, James said. They were separated by people who took advantage of their situation. They never knew each other's fate. In March 2020, the Manchester City Archives opened an exhibition called Separated, the true story of Victorian child migration. At the center was a photograph of Thomas and William, shown alongside the enhanced version highlighting the contract in Petton's pocket. The exhibit displayed documents from the British Juvenile Immigration Society, ship lists, contract files, and a few letters sent by children who were able to write home. Many, of course, could not. It also included records for children who passed away during their years in placement. Margaret and James both attended the opening. They stood together before the photograph. Two descendants of brothers who were torn apart 125 years earlier, now linked again through the truth. Thomas and William thought they'd see each other again soon. Margaret said at the ceremony, they believed Thomas was going to a better life, and that William would follow. They never knew the real reason they were separated. Their photograph now hangs in the Manchester City Archives with a plaque explaining its history. Thomas and William Ashford, March 14, 1895. Taken moments before 12-year-old Thomas was sent to Canada under false promises, the image contains visible evidence of the contract that bound him to years of unpaid work. The brothers never met again. Thomas died in Canada in 1967. William died in Manchester in 1904. The truth behind their separation was uncovered 125 years later through modern analysis. Thomas lived to 84 and raised a family, never knowing what happened to William. William died at 17, working in the same kind of mill that had claimed their father's life, unaware of where his brother had been sent. Their story shows how a system presented as charitable hid the reality of its actions. The photograph that captured their last embrace also held the clue that finally revealed the truth.